This past presidential primary, Cheryl Grossman voted, if you could call it that. Cheryl has Bloom syndrome, so she has an extremely weak immune system and impaired vision. The New York Times of September 25th, 2020 reports, after Cheryl called her local board of elections, two officials showed up at her house, where she had taped her ballot to a window outside of her home, and she watched them fill it out with choices she had pre-messaged election officials. She has no idea whether they filled it out correctly. The process was dehumanizing, making Cheryl wonder whether she will ever even vote again. Medical News Today of October 28th, 2020 reports, during previous elections, over 60% of polling places were inaccessible to disabled voters. This lack of accessible voting was only worsened by COVID-19, preventing people from voting as they normally do. However, Truth Out of May 12, 2020 argues that there is no better time to address this electoral shortchange, because the COVID-19 pandemic is showing just how inaccessible traditional voting is. But here's the thing. The pandemic only crystallizes the structural obstacles that have disenfranchised disabled voters for decades. Considering the ACLU of July 20th, 2020 estimates that 38 million plus eligible voters with disabilities continue to face barriers to voting despite laws that were supposed to fix this very issue. Action must be taken that gives all Americans, regardless of ability status, the chance to exercise their right to vote. So today, we will first examine how voters are systematically disenfranchised. Second, delve into why this disenfranchisement is ongoing. Before finally, proposing some suggestions to fix our elections. Before proposing solutions, when disability advocates fought for curb cuts in sidewalks, bicyclists, tourists with luggage, mothers pushing strollers also benefited. We can do the same with our elections, because accessibility means everyone wins. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 30 years ago and was hailed as revolutionary. But as any 30-year-old will tell you, 30 years means you're old. The ADA was promising at the time, but hasn't been enforced nor followed. Two ways voters are disenfranchised. We are reliant on paper ballots, and polling places are inaccessible. First, we are still reliant on paper balloting. Lou Ann Blake at the National Federation of the Blind explains that paper ballots are difficult for people with visual impairments to fill out privately, and people with motor impairment issues like Parkinson's can also find difficulty with dexterity. Many states have opted to increase their mail-in voting as a potential solution, but voting by mail must be accompanied with in-person voting for disabled voters who cannot fill out a ballot privately. Take Dr. Regina Root, a professor at the College of William and Mary, who needed her husband to vote for her because her visual impairment meant she couldn't read or fill out her ballot at home. She told the Washington Post of August 31st, 2020, "I love my husband, but for as much as I've studied, casting a vote independently is really important." Second, we know that the majority of polling places are inaccessible. What we don't know are the details. American Bar of June 28th, 2020 explains that while these obstacles include a lack of ramps, it also includes lesser-known accessibility impediments to those with visual, hearing, and fine motor impairments. For example, doors that are too narrow, obstructed pathways to navigate, lacking proper sign-ups, no audio or large print ballots for machines, and poll workers who couldn't troubleshoot issues or weren't trained in accessibility features. One person, one vote is a central doctrine of this nation, but we've done little to make sure everyone can actually get to the ballot box. This year, Joanne Wolf was forced to miss an election for the first time, unable to write by hand or sign an absentee ballot. When she sent in a ballot with a signature stamp, it was rejected, even after a spokesperson for the Ohio Secretary of State told her she could. It took months to resolve the confusion, but two obstacles to accessible voting remain: security concerns, and accessibility is demonized as unnecessary. First, the overemphasis on security. The Washington Post of March 3rd, 2020 informs that the US actually makes virtual voting possible for Americans overseas and military personnel. However, this system, which is far more accessible, is dismissed as a security threat if it were implemented nationally. Dr. Juan Gilbert, an expert on election technology at the University of Florida, disagrees. "You've actually weakened the security of an election by segregating voters," Gilbert said. With different ways of voting being used, it becomes far more difficult to monitor which to monitor each of them and ensure their safety. So it's better to have a uniform system of voting. Clearly, access and security are not mutually exclusive, but we treat them as if they are. Second, accessibility is deemed unnecessary. The Washington Informer of August 12, 2020 discusses a plan that calls for $3.6 billion to be allocated by Congress to assist with COVID and accessibility issues. Congressional representatives generally balk at the price tag. But last year, Americans spent over $4 billion playing fantasy football. Nonetheless, calls for funds are routinely disregarded as unnecessary. Fundamentally, accessible voting is a key issue that needs to be part of a broader portfolio of democratic reforms. But 538 of January 12, 2021 explains, because voters with disabilities have been historically ignored, their inclusion is deemed less necessary in electoral change. And so here we are, with millions of voters with disabilities and decades of accumulated frustration, still demanding that their voting rights be taken seriously. Americans with disabilities comprise the largest minority group in the nation. The collective voting power of this demographic alone is enough to reshape American politics. We need to make it possible for them to do so by getting to the ballot box. First, the most effective and sweeping solution is federal legislation. Thankfully, a bill already exists. The Accessible Voting Act of 2020. The bill requests over $2 billion in funding to revamp physical entrances to polling locations, increase access to screen readers, and establish accessibility audits through local board of elections. The bill is sponsored by high-profile Democrats like Bob Casey, Amy Klobuchar, Kristen Gillibrand. And considering the party just took the Senate, there's no time like now to push for its passing. I've already drafted a letter of support. If you give me your information through a Google Doc I'll share, I'll send one to your state senator for you. Let's take the long view. Digital voting is the accessible future. Mobile apps like Votes are already trying to implement voting strictly from your smartphones. Here's how it would work. On election day, you would get your ballot. You digitally select your choices, authenticate, and submit. Votes creates a paper trail that allows auditors to verify the security of an election with immediately created hard copy proofs. States like West Virginia, Oregon, and Utah have agreed to pilot them in their state elections. The New York Times of February 13th, 2020 warns that the tech isn't perfect by any means. But then again, neither is our current method. At the end of the day, we need to educate ourselves on the feasibility and accessibility of digital voting. I've compiled resources for you to not only learn about this future, but to explore ways to begin transitioning to digital voting. It's still a ways off, but we can start now. As the saying goes, democracy is a verb, not a noun. That's why we explored the disenfranchisement of disabled voters, why it continues, and some short and long-term solutions. Cheryl Grossman can't control the fact that she has Bloom syndrome, and she can't control that it makes it hard for her to vote. What she can control is a willingness to persist and her determination to be heard. And that's just it. So can we.